Session. Scrutiny of EU legislative proposals, Schedule B, Coms 2019-39, 2019-74, 2019-105, 2019-139 and 2019-194. It is proposed that these proposals do not warrant further scrutiny. Is that agreed? Agreed. Meeting with representatives of RACO. In today's meeting, we meet with Commandant Conor King, General Secretary, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Priestley, Deputy General Secretary, Commandant Seán Crowe, President of the Representative Association of Commissioned Officers of the Irish Defence Forces. You are very welcome here today to our committee meeting. At the outset of this meeting, may I pass on to this committee's highest regards to the men and women of both the Permanent and Reserve Defence Forces. This committee at every opportunity has raised the importance of setting out firm policies and actions for the retention of personnel in the Irish Defence Forces with both the Minister of State with responsibility for defence and with department officials. The members of the committee look forward to hearing your presentation in relation to these very important issues here today. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and persons in the public gallery to turn off their mobile phones. Members too are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient for members to just put their phones in silent mode, as this will maintain the level of interference with the broadcasting system. By virtue of Section 17(2)(L) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence in the Joint Committee. If they are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of their evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and they are asked to respect the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or body outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I now call on Commandant King to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Achahirlach, Bawahlam Mavukas a Gawal live as Uct an Quira a Hogan Kushtadom Laurch an Shaw Inu. I am honoured to address the Joint Committee on behalf of the officers of Óglaigh na hÉireann to highlight the current retention crisis affecting all ranks of the organisation, and I thank it sincerely for its invitation. It has been heartening to note the interest that committee members have in the welfare of Defence Forces personnel. And these loyal citizens need your support now more than ever. I am joined to my left by Lieutenant Colonel Derek Priestley, Deputy General Secretary of the Association, and to my right by Commandant Seán Crowe, RACO President. In discussing the retention crisis, I will also be touching on a number of contributing factors, including the lack of viable or credible retention policies within the Department of Defence and the weakened industrial relations status of the Defence Forces representative associations, which has been sadly exploited by government to the detriment of the well-being of the officers, soldiers, sailors and aircrew of Óglaigh na hÉireann, and which has left the state vulnerable. Train people well enough so they can leave. Treat them well enough so they don't want to. Although Richard Branson may not be viewed as an eminent military strategist, these words attributed to him are quite apt in this context. In the Defence Forces, we train our people to the highest standard, at no small cost to the Exchequer. We align their qualifications with best industry practice and academic accreditation, thereby satisfying the first criterion of this quote. Then we fail miserably in the second part. The dysfunctional cycle of turnover being suffered by the Defence Forces, identified by University of Limerick researchers in 2015 and 2017, has continued unabated to the point where Óglaigh na hÉireann is at its lowest strength in decades, and morale has certainly never been so low in my over 20 years' service as it is today. This trend appears set to continue, according to numerous Defence Forces employee engagement surveys and RACO's own recent research. 3,200 personnel left the Defence Forces in the 5 years between 2014 and 2018, which is an astonishing 34.7% of the average strength for those years. And before people think that this is due to the early mandatory retirement ages for Defence Forces personnel, I must categorically state that 82% of these were premature voluntary retirements. It was recently reported in numerous media publications that the unprecedented recruitment drive in the year 2017 yielded a net increase in the single figures in personnel, and that €15 million was spent in that year on induction training. It may shock the committee to learn that in 2018, the Defence Forces attempted to induct a similar number of candidates through a highly visible and professional recruitment campaign. Frighteningly, last year, 2018, saw a net loss of 120 personnel. In March of this year, RACO reported to the Public Service Pay Commission that the turnover rate was a devastatingly high 8.1%. It now stands at 9% overall and 14% in the Naval Service. For comparison, the UK Ministry of Defence recently declared a retention crisis at a turnover rate of 5%. There were 256 discharges in the first 4 months of 2019, which is by far the highest figure since the reorganisation of 2012. In April 2019 alone, there were an unprecedented 86 discharges from the Defence Forces. The impact of operating with reduced numbers is already being felt across the organisation. The Army is struggling to fulfil its assigned tasks, domestically and internationally. Ships are unable to go to sea, and aircraft are not flying as a result of these chronic personnel shortages. Yet the Department of Defence continues to prioritise costly recruitment policies in favour of tangible retention initiatives. This historically high turnover rate is leading to the creation of a crippling operational and training tempo for remaining service personnel. When is the government going to shout stop? Does it realise that defence capability is being ground into the dust? Does it care? Inadequate supervision and mentoring, combined with inadequate training manning levels, leads to inevitable burnout and creates serious concerns for governance and the ability to manage risk and to ensure the well-being of our personnel. The UL Climate Survey and Focus Group reports laid bare the mental health difficulties, increased stress and low morale being experienced by Defence Forces soldiers, sailors and aircrew. Our people are double and treble jobbing in an effort to maintain operational output due to inadequate trained manning levels in units. According to the Central Statistics Office, the Defence Forces has been the lowest paid public sector organisation for many years. This is ironic when the Institute of Public Administration has consistently reported that the Defence Forces is by far the most trusted public service organisation in the state, with a trust score of 82%. Something doesn't add up. 87% of all Defence Forces personnel earn below the average public sector wage. Senior government officials have been heard to remark that someone has to be the lowest paid. The fact that the lowest paid public sector organisation in the state is also the most defenceless in terms of advocating for its rights is deeply unfair and disrespectful to the men and women of Oireachtas na hÉireann, many of whom are forced to rely on social welfare to support their families. Normal public service employment conditions do not apply to those in the Defence Forces. Serving Defence Forces personnel forfeit normal employee status while remaining subject to military law at all times. They have no right to strike and can be called on 24/7, 365. They have an unlimited liability contract which requires them to face hardship and danger for the benefit of others. The health and safety provisions of the European Union Working Time Directive do not currently apply to the Defence Forces, and the state is currently in breach of this EU legislation. Personnel are subject to mandatory early retirement and are subject to annual military standard medical and fitness testing. We voluntarily accept these unique constraints, but we expect to be treated fairly in return. Defence management's obligation, in recognition of these service restrictions and industrial relations limitations, should be to advocate on behalf of Defence Forces personnel. What RACO members, however, see is an ongoing failure on the part of the Department of Defence to protect our weakened employee status, and in doing so, to ensure that the Defence Forces are not disadvantaged relative to other public service employees. Indeed, the approach to representation for the Department of Defence, which is divisive, dismissive and sometimes subversive, has led to an adversarial and dysfunctional industrial relations climate, which has been to the detriment of the well-being of the most loyal citizens of this state. It is nothing short of shameful. I am happy to elaborate further if required by the committee. The Department has failed to prioritise retention for the Defence Forces, even though it is evident that the continual recruitment campaigns are failing to address the ongoing reduction in overall strength. Why, when the Department of Defence saves millions every year on the backs of its employees, do they not see fit to introduce retention initiatives? This approach is in stark contrast to our near neighbours across the Irish Sea, whose respect and value for their servicemen and women is enshrined in an Armed Forces Covenant, which recognises the freedoms given up willingly by military personnel and their families, and the restrictions and hazards they face, but pledges to support, protect and treat them fairly. And let us not forget, soldiers are citizens too. The state must reconsider how it values its defence forces and what exactly it expects of them. Ireland spends a comparatively negligible 0.3% of its GDP on defence, which is the lowest in the EU, behind even Luxembourg and Malta. And this speaks volumes about how seriously the state views the security of its citizens and its economy. Initiatives to increase numbers include reducing the established benchmarks of entry standards, training standards and timelines, the dilution of security clearance measures and the reduction in recruit and cadet basic training timelines have had the objective of reducing the time to increase the numbers. These measures have had no medium or long-term impact other than to potentially expose the organisation to greater operational and organisational risk. No amount of water will fill a leaky bucket. In the face of strong objections by RACO at the time, the Department enthusiastically dispensed with the internationally proven model of fixed period promotion for technical officers of the Ordnance and Engineer Corps, leaving these officers with no viable career paths, effectively showing them the door. These officers are now faced with the choice of either returning to line units or leaving the Defence Forces if they wish to continue to advance their careers. In either event, 6 years of full-time training at significant cost to the state, in addition to several invaluable years of learning their trade, are being lost. Department of Defence removed retention initiatives for pilots, leading to a situation where the Air Corps is on its knees, with over 30% pilot deficiencies and counting, which, coupled with chronic shortages in aircraft technicians, has threatened operational capability and impacted on service delivery. Despite the unprecedented levels of induction training, officer instructors continue to be denied specialised instructor allowance, which was taken from them under Haddington Road and has yet to be reinstated. NCO instructors continue to receive this payment rightly, but officers bear the ultimate responsibility. But the single biggest factor negatively affecting retention in the Defence Forces, and hence the future viability of the organisation, is the removal of the supplementary pension from post-January 2013 new entrants. Government policy determines that all personnel are subject to early mandatory retirement ages, anywhere between their 54th or 60th birthday for officers, depending on rank. Hence, the vast majority of post-2013 single pension scheme officers will retire a full 10 years before they can receive the state pension. A recent RACO Amoric research survey found that a shocking 79% of officers inducted since 2013 intend to leave the organisation well in advance of their mandatory retirement ages. The lack of an adequate pension provision for this cohort means that a significant majority feel that they have no future in the Defence Forces and will not stay long enough to develop and advance up the ranks and populate the chronic shortages at middle management level. The unprecedented level of cadet inductions and associated unbearable burden it has placed on training capacity will all have been for nothing. To his credit, the Minister has recognised this and has pledged to address it as a priority once the pay issues have been resolved. The White Paper on Defence 2015 notes that the recruitment, training and development and retention of suitable military personnel are essential factors in developing the military capabilities required in order to discharge the roles assigned by government. Despite this, no initiative or review has been initiated to address these issues. The delay in commencing White Paper projects concerning the ongoing recruitment and retention issues is indicative of the current approach to personnel policy in the Defence Organisation. And the consequence to the organisation is the present manning level crisis and loss of corporate memory and military expertise on an alarming scale. The Minister and his officials claim that this White Paper and the identified projects towards implementation are cognizant of the priority of demands. Why then has the project team failed to even commence the most critical and pressing human resource projects which concern retention? None of the projects completed to date are assessed to have had any significant impact on the retention crisis. The White Paper implementation approach has not yet yielded any tangible impact on the Defence Forces. RACO views it as nothing more than a box-ticking exercise. The cost-benefit of retention is indisputable. The unique demands of Defence Force service require unique specialist in-house military training and the development of military specialist skills. A direct entry civil engineer, for example, would have to undergo 2 years military training and professional development in military engineering competencies before being available for operational taskings. Similarly, the costs associated with developing the range of military competencies can amount to 1.54 million for an ordnance bomb disposal officer at captain rank, or 1.72 million for a captain pilot in the Air Corps. The cost of training one officer cadet is estimated at over €100,000 per student. At what point of dysfunction will management favour retention over the continual failing demands of recruitment? We cannot go to market to replace a middle manager, such as an experienced captain or sergeant. We replace them with cadets and recruits. At a turnover rate of 9%, the policy is destined to fail. With this in mind, a comprehensive external review, similar in nature and scope to the Gleeson Commission on Remuneration and Conditions of Service in the Defence Forces of 1990, or even the recent Commission on Future Policing, should now be considered by government, where management are unable or unwilling to address the underlying organisational issues. The Defence Forces is currently surviving on the goodwill of its personnel. That willingness to go over and above the call of duty to achieve the mission or complete the task. The inability of personnel to take to the streets to protest at their appalling service conditions has resulted in them voting with their feet and leaving the organisation. It is, however, humbling to witness the concerned efforts of veteran and family organisations in attempting to highlight the shameful treatment of service personnel. Their efforts have not gone unnoticed and hopefully shall not be in vain. Mr. Chairman, it is no exaggeration to state that the Defence Forces is staring into the abyss. The reported meagre recommendations of the Public Service Pay Commission have the potential, if implemented, to act as a catalyst for further departures. Government should be encouraged to ensure that the loyalty displayed by thousands of soldiers, sailors and aircrew is reciprocated, and that they be paid a living wage, and that their skill and experience be recognised for the indispensable and irreplaceable asset it truly is. RACO strongly recommends the adoption of a specific Defence Forces standing independent pay review body to ensure military personnel are fairly treated. Unnecessary suffering is the worst kind, and government has it within its power to easily remedy many of the retention difficulties being experienced by Óglaigh na hÉireann and to begin to rehabilitate this proud and loyal organisation. It is for government to decide whether we are finally going to take the security of our state seriously and allow our Defence Forces to do what they signed up for, to strengthen the nation that they love, providing the security that allows our democracy and our economy to flourish. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee for your time, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Commandant King, for your detailed outline of the very serious issues facing the Defence Forces, and you outlined clearly there that, I take from your comments that you are concerned about the capacity of the Defence Forces to carry out their basic obligations and duties, and I thank you for your detailed presentation. We'll take questions from the members and we can have an exchange with yourself, Commandant King, or with your colleagues as well. So Deputy Jack Chambers to be followed by Deputy Tony McLoughlin.
Thanks, Chair, and I'd like to thank Conor, Derek, Shane and for coming in before us, and I think you've painted a very stark picture and with the decimation, demoralisation and the destruction of the Defence Forces as it has been under the tenure of Minister Keogh, and I think it's the common thread of defence policy over the last number of years has been his tenure within the Department of Defence and his refusal to budge on some of the key issues, as you've mentioned. When you go through what you've outlined around the dysfunctional cycle of turnover, the premature voluntary retirements, and the fact that the turnover rate is up this year versus previous years, the total deficiencies around the capacity and the strength, and your recommendation for an external organisational review, I think demonstrates the difficulty you have as an organisation to actually properly address the issues with the Department of Defence, and I think that it's shameful that a department would treat a representative organisation with such disrespect and disregard. I also want to acknowledge Cathal Berry, who's here, who has provided a very alarming account, but an unsurprising one in recent days, and I thank him for his honesty and his integrity in speaking out on behalf of the men and women of our defence forces, who I think are suffering on a daily basis. Just going through some of the questions from your script. What retention initiatives? Obviously, you've highlighted the ongoing line and rhetoric from government that they peddle is that they're going to recruit their way out of this crisis, and one of the consistent responses from you and the other organisations in defence is around retention initiatives. Can you provide some detail about what retention initiatives you would bring in? Also, the fact that Ireland is breaching the Working Time Directive on an ongoing basis when it comes to our defence forces. How have your engagements been with the department on that? I think they've been brought kicking and screaming by the representative organisations to the courts when it comes to this issue. But how can you just provide some insight into your engagement with them? And how do you envisage the future of representation for the defence forces and formalising that in a greater and substantive way? Perhaps also can you provide maybe a bit of detail about how your relationship with the department is, because one of the criticisms from Cathal Berry and others who are retired now is that there's a serious issue, it appears, in the Department of Defence, and it's the net point that's coming up over and over again. What do you mean when you stated when the white paper is a box-ticking exercise? Is it providing, I suppose, it's providing a barrier for progress on some of the key issues that you have? And also, I suppose, you've mentioned the drop in the numbers and the difficulties around paying conditions and the fact that the turnover rate is rising and we can't meet our white paper target. Can you provide some detail about the implications of this retention crisis for the viability of the defence forces and the security of the state? For example, is the emergency ambulance service in Athlone under threat? Could you maybe provide some detail? There's a lot of public alarm about what happened with the Gorse fires and the response time there in recent days. And we've also had the Department of Defence saying that there are no problems with the strength of the defence forces, and they say that the organisation is at 93%. And I think that level of inaccuracy and spin from a department is very worrying. And how would you respond to their ongoing refusal to acknowledge the core crisis that we have? Also, can you've said there's a poor level of governance maybe in the department. Can you outline what your insight on that is? I think I've asked enough questions now, Chair.
Thanks, Deputy Chambers. Deputy Tony McLoughlin.
Thank you very much, Donald King and your colleagues. You're very, very welcome here this morning, and thanks for coming in. I've just a couple of brief questions that perhaps maybe you might be able to just enlighten me on, because I've had discussions with some colleagues from Finner Camp. It would be part of my constituency, and just to enlighten me, you mentioned there about, can you explain to me what you mean by strength in station? You've referred to that in your comments there, and also just perhaps maybe the numbers of officers stationed at Finner Camp. Are the numbers very, very low at the present time? This is what I've been led to believe. Would that be the case? Like, you know what I mean? And some of your colleagues have said to me in relation to income and their salaries. Perhaps maybe you might outline to me or give me some indication as to what the income is, or their gross wage or weekly wage or whatever else. Just say from 3-star private, perhaps maybe up to colonel or whatever else. Just to give me some indication as to what the rates of pay are, because it's important that people that are giving the service that they're giving to the Defence Forces are representing this country all over the world, that they would be well looked after, that there would be, you know, any educational training and opportunities available to the officers, and what is available to your colleagues in the Army, and you know, in relation to education and training. And I think that's vitally important because of the work that they do. And in fact, these people have been wonderful ambassadors all over the world in peacekeeping and other opportunities. You know, opportunities for promotion. What is the criteria in relation to RACA's opportunities there? Perhaps maybe you might outline to me as well in relation to that, just to give me some detail, say for perhaps maybe for privates to become an officer within the Army, if that's the route that they take, or is that the preferred option within RACA? So perhaps maybe you might just outline some of the details, please. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deputy McLoughlin. Commandant King or your colleagues, one or the other?
Thank you, Deputy Chambers and Deputy McLoughlin. I suppose I better start from the start and take Deputy Chambers' questions first, if that's okay, and then go on to you, Deputy. You asked us what retention initiatives we would bring in. We've been speaking about the various retention initiatives with the Department of Defence and the official side in general for many years at this stage, and we feel that we're not being heard. First of all, we are fully aware that there is a Public Service Pay Commission ongoing, which is a specific pay commission identified to address the appalling rates of pay in the Defence Forces. And the leaks that came out were extremely concerning in terms of what was proposed. Obviously, until we see the final document, we cannot know for certain. However, what I will say is the reported 10% increase in military service allowance for the most junior private equates to less than €1 a day gross. Okay? For a captain, it equates to €1.29 per day gross. These are not going to arrest the slide. So what I would call on, if at all possible, and if the committee could influence at all possible, the Public Service Pay Commission need to go back and have another look at how they're going to fix the problems in the Defence Forces. The Defence Forces receives unique set of allowances which are separate from the rest of the public sector, which take into account their unlimited liability, their unwillingness to strike or withdraw labour, their posting 24/7, 365, their exposure to danger, their lack of protection of the Working Time Directive. So it's easy to separate those out. And as well as military service allowance, there is also potential to increase the likes of patrol duty allowance for the naval service, as you know, and as I've said, it's 14% in the turnover rate in the naval service at the moment. Security allowance, return of premium payments for Saturdays and Sunday duties, which was taken away during the financial crash. We're not in the crash anymore. And other various allowances, all of which have been made by RACO to the Public Service Pay Commission in a detailed submission. What else could we talk about in terms of retention initiatives? They're not just remuneration initiatives. There are fundamental organisational structure issues with the Defence Forces in terms of training establishments. Before the reorganisation, we had 500 personnel training establishment, which gave a small bit of fat from when we wanted to do induction training. We weren't counting those strength figures on our overall strength, which is not the case now. We could do with a junior officer overseas establishment, for example, because when someone goes overseas, their job is not filled at home. Someone has to double job. And the same for non-commissioned officers. We could do with having a transparent and accurate posting and human resource management policy for officers and NCOs. And I suppose the most fundamental retention issue, and one that we have been pursuing since 2011 now, although the department have only started to speak to us on this in the last 2 years, is the Working Time Directive, which has illegally been denied to the Defence Forces. There are a few of the retention initiatives I could talk about for now. One other one I did mention in the opening statement was the return of fixed period promotion. And it's a fallacy that you can recruit qualified, highly specialised technical officers and non-commissioned officers and expect them to be up to speed straight away. We spoke about it costs 1.7 million for a pilot, 1.5 million for an ordnance officer. These are the people who the state depend on. These are the people who the security of the state depends on. And the fact that fixed period promotion was so enthusiastically removed by the Department of Defence, it just beggars belief. And it actually galls and upsets me to see friends of mine, colleagues of mine, people who I've trained with, cadet classmates of mine, who joined the Ordnance Corps with a view to adding value to the state, and found that they were unable to continue to maintain a work-life balance and unable to continue to maintain their service to the Defence Forces because of failed Department of Defence policies. In relation to what is the future of representation, again, we mentioned in the opening statement that our representative status has been taken advantage of by the Department of Defence. Their dismissive and divisive attitude that they have to representation has just meant that we have been effectively neutered. And when we go into pay talks, we're outside of the room. The decisions are already made, the deals are already done. In the UK, the armed forces do not go into public service pay talks. They have a standing armed forces pay review body which recognises the unique nature of military service. It recognises the civil liberties that are given up. It recognises the fact that they have unlimited liability, exposure to hazard and danger, and the fact that they can be posted anywhere, at any time, for any duration, at short notice, away from their families and loved ones. And what this standing armed forces pay review body does is it looks at the pay. If there are gaps in the allowances and pay, it tweaks them immediately. There have been over 43 reports done since the inception of this armed forces pay review body, and it is reactive and it works. It would mean that Defence Forces representative associations would not have to go into public service pay talks and act like a union, because that's not in our ethos and it's not in our culture. We just want to be looked after by the state because we provide loyalty to the state. It spoke about the white paper and why we describe it as a box-ticking exercise. The white paper is the white paper 2015. We're now in 2019. The white paper includes 88 white paper projects and action items. Every time we look for a brief from the Department of Defence on the white paper, we come away frustrated and none the wiser about what's going on. In fact, it would be funny if it wasn't so serious that when the 5 items that were listed by the Department of Defence as being transitioned to normal business and completed as white paper projects were read out in the Dáil last year, they included civil defence, employment support scheme, Red Cross, major emergency management framework, and civilian employees, none of which have any tangible effect on the retention crisis in the Defence Forces. It is a white paper box-ticking exercise. That's all we can say about that. We have asked several times for specific briefings on retention projects from the white paper to be met with silence. And that's why we call it a box-ticking exercise. We can call it nothing else. The strength figures. You spoke about the strength figures and when the Dáil is told that 93% is the current strength of the Defence Forces. That may well be the case on paper on the personnel management system. It does not, however, take into account the fact that there are over 500 personnel at all times on induction training who are non-deployable. You could not legally give those people a rifle and get them to go on an operation or an exercise. It doesn't account for the fact that there are 670 odd people overseas. It doesn't account for the fact that there are over 100 members of the Defence Forces on leave of absence at any time. And it doesn't account for the fact that there are 100 members of the Defence Forces at least on long-term detachments, on career courses, etc., and not available to their units. The fact that those figures are included gives a misleading representation of the current state of play in the Defence Forces. And when it is reported that, for example, the officer strength is in the 90th percentile, 92 or 3% or whatever is reported lately, we have to remember that at least 300 of those officers are newly commissioned in the last 3 years due to the unprecedented nature of panicked recruitment into the cadet school, which is actually stressed to the point of breaking. And that just paints an inaccurate picture of the strength of the Defence Forces. So does that explain the point? In relation to the Emergency Air Medical Service, while it would be remiss of me to comment on operational issues, and they are matters for general staff and military management, what I can say about the Air Corps is that it is under severe stress at the moment. The current strength of pilots in the Air Corps is at 70% and falling. The air traffic control officers at 66%, NCOs at 50%. In terms of the helicopter wing of the Irish Air Corps, it was reported recently that the aircraft technicians are at 44% and the pilots are at 59%. So the man on the street can tell you that the organisation is under pressure, and the implications for the services it provides must surely be under pressure and under strain. In relation to governance, this is a serious concern of ours. Historically, we would have seen governance at unit level being enshrined, particularly from the logistics side of the House, in the likes of a captain quartermaster or a battalion quartermaster sergeant, a company quartermaster sergeant, and dedicated store staff who would have been working in this stream from the beginning of their careers. We've gone around the country, we've spoken to subject matter experts, we've spoken to the logistics experts in the Defence Forces, and they have seen newly commissioned officers, second lieutenants, who really don't have the experience or the qualifications, filling the roles of Captain QM, where there is no senior enlisted leadership in terms of company quartermaster sergeant or battalion quartermaster sergeant in the unit to mentor or supervise them. It is rare to see the same officer or NCO in a logistics appointment for a full year. When we went to a unit this year in February, we learned that there was one captain out of 8 in that unit. One captain out of 8 in the middle management ranks. And, as I've already said, a second lieutenant was the logistics officer. That would normally be a captain of 15 years' experience. Something has to give. And we are already seeing little accidents, the nature of which I won't go into. But we expect more unless something changes. This is due primarily to a shortage of officers in the middle ranks. Ironically, the majority of officers who are leaving from middle and upper management, and this sees captains being promoted to commandant more quickly, and you would say this is a good thing, but it is leaving gaps at the captain rank. So we're robbing Peter to pay Paul constantly, and it results in a loss of corporate knowledge of how the Defence Forces conducts its business. And finally, in terms of governance, a significant number of young officers are coming under high levels of stress due to the organisational need putting the responsibilities on their young shoulders that they are not equipped to deal with. They don't have the mentoring or supervision to guide them along or hold them by the hand. You know, this is serious stuff we're talking about. This is the execution of lethal force. And a second lieutenant doing a captain's job is dangerous. That's all I'm going to say about governance for now, but I hope I've painted a clear enough picture. Have I answered the questions to your satisfaction?
Deputy Chambers back in. Deputy McLaughlin's question.
Deputy McLoughlin, you mentioned Finner Camp, and yes, you're correct to say that the officer strength in Finner Camp has been extremely low consistently over the last number of years. The last time I was up in Finner Camp, I believe there was 1 commandant out of 5. The strength in station, and I think I've explained to Deputy Chambers, is the strength that's available to a unit commander to exercise his operations or exercise their daily duties. And when we go around the country and we see 5 officers out of 21 or out of 25 in some infantry battalions, when we see a transport group with 6 out of 24, when we see an ordnance company who are responsible for bomb disposal at 16% of their officers, then the figures are stark. In terms of education and training, look, it's clear to us that we work hard at it on education and training. Like, we train for what we can predict and we educate for those things that we can't predict. And we do provide good opportunities for education and training for our personnel. Of that there can be no doubt. We accredit personnel. Like I said at the outset, we train people to the best of our abilities, and we train people that they can actually leave with good qualifications. But we should be treating them so they want to stay, and we're not doing that. In relation to the rates of pay for the Defence Forces, I don't have them quite to hand here. What I can say is the recruit will start out at €19,000 gross, and then will graduate to €29,000. After 12 years, a private soldier will be on €37,000. In terms of officers will start at €35,000 once commissioned, and that goes all the way up to the most senior commandant could be up to €65,000 or €70,000. That is a fact. What I can say also, and I will reiterate, is that 87% of the Defence Forces are below the average public sector wage. 87%. There are opportunities for promotion, and again, ironically, because of the manning level shortages at middle management, it means that there are vacancies cropping up on a regular basis. In fact, it is the case in the Air Corps at the moment, where we have more vacancies than we have people qualified for, such as the level of brain drain coming out of the Air Corps. We have lieutenant colonel vacancies that we can't fill because we don't have people qualified to fill them. They don't have the courses done that they need to qualify. So the promotions are there. In terms of privates transitioning to commissioned life, absolutely. In fact, privates would actually get a 6%, I believe, increase or a bump in an interview process to recognise their previous military service. And we welcome the fact that a private soldier or a non-commissioned officer would want to become an officer. Absolutely. We think that is a very positive thing. I think that's addressed your questions, Deputy. Thank you.
Thanks, Conor King. Deputy Noel Grealish and then Senator Gabrielle McFadden.
I want to thank the officers for coming in and painting such a bleak picture, and your honesty and the situation within the Defence Forces. Look, we're not going to go in on the work. I'm not going to go elaborate on the work that the Defence Forces do. We all know the excellent work that they do. We're not here to talk about that. Where has it gone all wrong? I think there was an article in the Irish Times recently where a former member of the Defence Forces, Gerard Herden, said that the relationship between the department and the Defence Forces was toxic and dysfunctional. I'd like you to elaborate on that. Where is it gone on? Where has it all gone wrong? Who is actually in the hierarchy fighting for the members of the Defence Forces? Are the senior officers in the Defence Forces doing what they're supposed to be doing? Is the department fighting strong enough for the members of the Defence Forces, or is the Minister at Cabinet table? When you go back, when previous governments, there used to be a senior minister at the Cabinet table for the Department of Minister for Defence. Now we have a junior Minister for Defence at the Cabinet table, and it seems to a lot of this is happening under that watch. And the question is, have you confidence in the Minister? Have you confidence in the department, which is headed up by the Secretary General, or have you confidence in the officers, the senior officers in the army? Are they fighting strong enough to get what the ordinary member of the Defence Forces deserve, which is fair play and fair pay? I'm dealing a lot, we've done the milice in Galway. I meet a lot of the Defence Forces and members, and a lot of them are telling me they're trying to leave to join an Garda Síochána, which is, I think there's a lot of them are doing that, are leaving. They're trained. They would be make excellent members of the Garda Síochána, and I think it's a disgrace that that is happening. You've talked about the air service under threat, and in Athlone, my colleague Deputy Chambers raised that. That provides an excellent service. I live in Galway. I see that helicopter 2 or 3 times a day flying between Athlone and University Hospital Galway, and I'm sure it has saved many a life. I have visited the hospital in Roscommon, and if a person has a cardiac arrest or a serious accident, the ambulance is brought in straight away, the air ambulance, to bring that patient to University Hospital Galway, and I'm sure it has saved, and I think to be very serious if that service is under threat. But is there the same crisis in the naval services? Is there a situation where we're going to have boats tied up in the docks in Galway, Cork or wherever, where we just don't have the officers for these boats, the naval ships, and we've bought new ones to set sail? Maybe you could elaborate on that as well. Are you aware, or look, and I don't want to go in, and I'm sure the members of the Defence Forces, like the getting Fisk, and unfortunately some of them are, would you have the numbers as to how many members in the Defence Forces would be availing of family income supplement? And I think it's a disgrace that that is happening. I think to be the only public sector organisation that would be in receipt of such a payment. I don't think I ever heard of a Garda getting it or a civil servant getting it, but if members of the Defence Forces, and if you have the numbers, I think that is a disgrace if that is happening. Sorry, here, look, just on the strength of the Defence Forces. No, sorry, there's one issue here, I think, in your opening speech that you said, RACO strongly recommends the adoption of a specific Defence Force pay review body to ensure military personnel are fairly treated. You might elaborate on that, if you don't mind. Maybe there's, look at, I've asked a few questions on the relationship between the Department, the Minister of Defence and the organisation, and I'd like to know where you see where that has all gone wrong, and that has seemed to stem from. It's up the ladder where the problem is. It's not down at the bottom of the ladder. It's at the top of the ladder. Maybe you might elaborate where you feel where the problem is and how could it be fixed.
Thanks, Deputy Grealish. Senator McFadden.
Thank you. Good morning, Commandant King and Commandant Crowe, and Lieutenant Colonel Priestley. You're very welcome. It gives me great pleasure to welcome a fellow Athlonian. A lot of what I wanted to ask has already been spoken about or asked. I feel very strongly about this issue, and I really admire your respect that you show the committee and indeed the department and the minister under difficult circumstances. And I think, you know, the retired Sergeant Major Noel O'Sullivan and his protest or his parades have always had the theme of respect and loyalty, and I think that comes out in every member of the Defence Forces, no matter what they do, and I really would like to acknowledge that. For fear that it would go out of here today that any young person thinking of getting involved or joining the Defence Forces, that it's all bleak, I would love you to tell people that might hear this about the benefits of perhaps overseas deployment, of the benefits, you know, of career enhancement, or of the benefits of full-time education and courses that can be done. That's on the positive side. But some of what I would like to have asked has already been touched on, but the lack of corporate governance and the shortage of middle management that you have spoken about. Can you tell me more about that in terms of how does that affect we'll say the members and the levels of stress or the risk that they're put under, or indeed, as you have mentioned, the mistakes that are possible, because, you know, these are very serious situations and we can't afford mistakes. Also, the implication of low numbers. Can you talk to me about that in terms of the air ambulance? I fought very hard for the air ambulance when it was a pilot scheme to be maintained and to be maintained in Athlone, in Costume Barracks, and I would hate to see anything happen that. And with the level of difficulty that there are with Air Corps pilots, can you talk to me about that, you know, real danger of that service? The white paper. I came in after a by-election in 2014, and I attended the symposium in Farmley on the white paper, and was full of the joys of life, having heard about how it was going to talk up the Defence Forces for the next 10 years, and felt very positive coming out of my day in Farmley, thinking it was going to be great. I don't think it was ever intended to be a box-ticking exercise. I think it was intended with the, you know, to do the right thing. Can you tell me, has there been anything at all delivered from that white paper? You know, a real, actual, tangible thing. Has any of it been delivered? Has there not been anything at all? And if there was three things we could do or lobby for you here today, what would those 3 things be? Thank
Senator
you.
McFadden, Commodore King.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Deputy Grealish. So again, courtesy, I'll take Deputy Grealish first, as he asked questions first, and then I'll go on to you, Senator. The relationship between the Department of Defence and representative associations is a difficult one. There can be no doubt. I've already touched on it in the opening statement. There is an obsession with control and micromanagement in the Department of Defence, an obsession with control. And we would be of the firm opinion that the military advice is not heeded by the Department. This makes it difficult to conduct our business in terms of the conciliation and arbitration process. And there is a major difficulty in terms of communication, in terms of receiving written communication, receiving replies and responses, and in terms of differences in opinion about the right to representation of our own members under Defence Force Regulation S6, which the Department on many occasions have sought to deny us as a representative association. So if we cannot represent our members under Defence Force Regulation, what is the alternative? Are senior officers doing what they should be doing? We are all leaders in the Defence Forces, and it's incumbent upon us, and we are responsible to do the best that we can do with the resources that we have. But when you give a unit commander less than 50% of his or her resources, then it is impossible to do the job to the excellent level that you are trained to do. As a serving Defence Forces member, and I speak on behalf of my colleagues too, we are apolitical, and it would not be right or proper for me to comment on the confidence in an elected official or elected representative. I must say that. What I can say is that this is an unprecedented retention crisis in the Defence Forces. And at the current turnover rate of 9%, and at the current unprecedented and unsustainable levels of induction training, the Defence Forces will not reach the authorised strength of 9,500 personnel, all ranks, until 2035. Again, it is extremely apparent to me that the Emergency Air Medical Service is rightly recognised as an excellent service and a vital service for rural Ireland and for the Midlands and for the rest of the country in general. Remember, it is one crew, one EAS crew on 24 hours. We have 2 24-hour crews in the Air Corps. The other one is the Guard Air Support Unit. They are all that we can manage. We would love to have 10 EASs and 10 GAZUs, but we just don't have the resources, obviously. I think I've spelled out to each and every one of you the retention difficulties in the heli wing of Baldonnel of the Air Corps and the implications that has for service delivery. It's not for me to say whether an operation is under threat or not. In terms of the Naval Service, 14% turnover says a lot. 5% is a crisis, according to the UK Department of Defence. And in the Naval Service at the moment, there are 9 ships with a crew for 7. Able seamen are at 50% strength in station in the Naval Service. Able mechanics are at 46%. Communications operatives are at 50%. Cooks are at 70%. And the diving section, who are rightly lauded for their bravery in the operations that they conduct, are at 33% strength in station. In terms of Lieutenant Naval Service Marine Engineering officers who are vital for the safe operation of Naval Service patrol vessels, the effective strength in April 2019 for these officers was 36%. These obviously have knock-on effects for morale, for governance, for mentoring, for supervision of the Naval Service. And it is no wonder that the turnover rate in the Naval Service is so high when they are being asked to shoulder the burden every day. In terms of how has this affected people on the ground, or on the waves, as we would say, it impacts on operational capability in the areas of maintenance of the ships, boat cranes, armaments, etc. The stated policy of Naval Service Operations Command is 2 years in, 2 years out. Everybody relies on that. Families plan on that. Lives are built around that in the Naval Service. But personnel are finding that they have to apply now to come ashore after their 2 years are up. And as a limited number of reliefs are available for obvious reasons, not all are facilitated in coming ashore. So what does that say for morale? What does that say for the hope for the future and the maintenance of a proper family life? Working Time Directive implementation will certainly focus the minds in the Defence Forces and the Department of Defence as to how we can safely operate our naval service operations. And remember, like, the Irish Naval Service patrols an area 12 times the area of the country itself. You know, and we do not resource this service properly. I want to speak about family income supplement very briefly, or working family payment as is known now. And all I'll say about that is, like, while we're not the competent authority on social welfare by any manner of means, and I think the Minister has reported that only 90 people are in receipt of family income supplement in the Defence Forces. Only 90. One is too many. One is too many. The loyal servants of this state should not be supplemented by social welfare. I must make that point, and I cannot make that any clearer. So please, let us not have any more talk of 90 being only a figure. And what isn't reported is the amount of personnel in the Defence Forces who could be eligible for family income supplement or working family payment. And it obviously depends on the number of dependents you have. But analysis has been done that if a person is the only earner in a family, and with the rate of postings away from home that military personnel have to deal with, quite often they are and can only be the only earners in the family because the spouse is looking after the children and dependents. Up to 1,700 people could be eligible in the Defence Forces for family income supplement or working family payment. Now, working family payment, as the Minister rightly says, is a matter between the individual and the Department of Employee Affairs and Social Protection, so I can't comment on the accuracy of the 90. What I can say is it should be 0. You spoke about the Defence Forces pay review body and how we would envisage that. My colleague Derek Priestley here has spoken at length on this at one of our conferences and is an expert on it. I might get him to just give you his perspective on it, Derek.
Sure. Thank you, Deputy, for the question. And I think it was in the context you asked us where we've been fairly treated. And I can only give you my experience over the last 5 years of being full-time at RACO. And when you go into, national pay talks and you're left sitting in the corridor for 3 weeks, it's very hard to feel that you're being treated fairly. The opportunity to put forward your concerns of your members in relation to pay or allowances, the overwhelming numbers of the members of ICTU and that being in that environment, we're meant to be in a parallel process, but in reality you're not. And we've had experience of literally being the last people to leave the WRC and turn off the lights and still not have got a fair hearing on the first time outing. The second time for what we call Lansdowne Road 2, a decision was made on the second day to allow the representative associations, and I include the Gardaí in that, into the main room. But again, without the full status of IOR mechanisms behind you, your voice is not heard. As an association, we represent 1,200 people. PD4 are probably, 7,000. I'm not quite sure what the Gardaí is. But what isn't recognised is the uniqueness of military service and all of that, and our ability to come forward and speak. So our experience of national pay talks, while on the face of it may appear that we got fair treatment, but the reality was very, very different. And it was certainly very different the second time out, while we were allowed into the main room, but we were nobody. And we accept that, by the way. I think officers in particular are very accepting of the role they play in society and the duties that they take on voluntarily. So, going back to November 17, at one of our conferences, we had done a bit of research and we looked at how other militaries were looked at and treated. And we've very much identified in the UK where they had a pay review body a statutory body, one of 8, that existed right across the public sector, which was specific to that sector. And what was interesting about it was a full-time committee. It sat on an annual basis. It had access to the highest levels of government, to the Ministry of Defence, their general staff, and of course all the members of the armed services in the UK. And on an annual basis they engaged with all of these. They also had access to relevant data, and the big thing we're talking about today is retention. They very much knew where the pressure points were there in terms of recruitment versus retention. And when figures fell below a certain amount, and in this case if recruitment and retention was falling or failing to such an extent that they fell below 2% of design strength, and we're talking about trained personnel, not talking about new entrants or cadets or newly inducted people, we're talking about trained personnel. If it fell below 2% in a particular area, they immediately moved to address that situation. And what they did was they made a recommendation to government to either adjust allowances up or down, or specific to that circumstance. Now, before you think this is a great deal for the representative associations, they get what they want, all of that is done within the parameters of national pay policy from government. Government, it is controlling it at the end of the day, but they are very much aware of the uniqueness of the service and the position that happened. So we very much targeted the idea of a pay review body would be a way forward. We are cognizant that we're talking as well, with a pending report from the Public Service Pay Commission. As an association, we put a huge amount of effort into our first submission to the first report of the Public Service Pay Commission. We were heartened to see, not only the Defence Forces, but RACO and PD4 have mentioned throughout. We were heartened to see the Commission being directed to come back and look at recruitment and retention, not only in the HSE and related areas and the Defence Forces. But we have to say it's 2.5 years later and we're still waiting for a report to go to government. What will come out of it, we have no idea. I think we're all aware of the leaks that came with it. If it's a case that what is reported is true, we'd be very disappointed after all that effort. So to kind of sum up all of that, absolutely we would see a pay review body. Do we feel we're being treated fairly? I would say on behalf of the membership, I don't see members feel that they're being treated fairly. And I think we can prove that with the statistics that Conor has mentioned frequently. There is an opportunity to do the right thing here. We've been calling for it for 2.5 years. We're not critical of the Public Service Pay Commission. I think they've followed their terms of reference quite closely, but it's time for action on this side of the House.
Thanks. Thanks, Derek. Senator McFadden, I want to thank you first of all for your kind words about the respect and loyalty that we do endeavour to show to government, but mainly to the citizens of Ireland. And we firmly believe that we serve the state, and we do so without fear or favour. You mentioned the positives, and we don't want to be negative. We love the Defence Forces. That's the reason we're in this job. We love the Defence Forces. And might I say, and I know Deputy Chambers mentioned Commandant Berry, he left because he loved the Defence Forces. He left because he couldn't make a difference under the current climate. So make no mistake, there are extreme positives in the Defence Forces. I might get the President of the Association to talk about those positives in terms of what it means to be not only an officer but a member of Óglaigh na hÉireann. Shane.
Good morning, Deputy, and thank you for the question. And at the outset, I'd just like to thank the committee on behalf of my members. I'm the President of RACO, so that our members are very appreciative of this opportunity, the opportunity to air some of their concerns, because there is a lot of frustration out there, so we really are very appreciative of the opportunity. To answer your question about the positives, undoubtedly there are a lot of positives associated with the career in the Defence Forces, and in that plays out very well because we still are recruiting effectively. We're enticing people in because there are a lot of things to focus on in the Defence Forces. When you're inducted initially, we train you to become a soldier or a sailor or an airman or airwoman, but there are numerous opportunities thereafter to become an engineer, to become an air traffic controller, be a member of the Special Forces, become a doctor, to become a lawyer. there are ample opportunities out there. And that's to be encouraged and is encouraged, and we do facilitate that training internally, because we are a micro-community. We have to do everything ourselves, because when we deploy overseas, we have to provide all the services internally. So there's a need for all that training. But our training resources are at capacity, and that's something that has to be realised. And there are opportunities as well internally in terms of overseas, and it's an exciting job when you sell it to civilian at the point of induction. So the issue really isn't the job. The job is a fantastic job. Everybody in the Defence Forces loves the Defence Forces, and that's shown through in the UL research, that people want to stay in the Defence Forces, it's just they feel they can't stay. So it's not recruitment that's the issue, it's retention. We're harping back on retention, unfortunately, because that is the issue. So the members are extremely loyal to state, will always remain loyal to the state, and they want to stay. We just have to provide the environment to them so that they can stay.
Thanks, Shane. You asked about three things, a wish list, 3 wishes. There are a number of things that are required. However, the first thing and the most short-term thing is, as we've spoken about, there is a pay commission ongoing, Public Service Pay Commission, and it has to deliver. 10% on MSA will not do the trick, and in fact, we fear will act as a catalyst for future departures. Have a look, please, at the unique nature of military service. Have a look at our refusal to withdraw labour. Recognise the fact that we are loyal to the state and treat us fairly. There is scope, without breaking any public service stability agreements, to look after the Defence Forces. That's the first ask. The second ask, and I suppose it ties into the Public Service Pay Commission to one extent in that it's included in our submissions, but there are various retention initiatives that could be reinstated or introduced in the Defence Forces in terms of fixed period promotion, but more crucially, for all post-2013 new entrants, have a look, please, at the single pension scheme and the fact that you are not providing a viable long-term career for post-2013 new entrants. The Amoric Research Survey told us specifically that cadets now are cognizant of the fact that this is no longer a long-term career in the Defence Forces, and we cannot go to market to recruit a captain or a sergeant. So they are deciding that they're going to join, they're going to get all they can out of the Defence Forces short term, and come their mid to late 30s, it's decision time. And if they know that they're going to be retired forcibly at the age of 54 for a captain or 58 for a commandant, and have to wait 10 years for the single pension scheme, or sorry, for the supplementary, the state pension contributory, the old age pension as it was, why would they stay? We have to incentivise people to stay in the Defence Forces. And then, I suppose the last 2 things are larger strategic issues. We spoke about the Defence Forces pay review body. Our place is not a pay talks. We've learnt that. A standing Defence Forces pay review body, independent, which constantly sits and examines the resources available to the Defence Forces in terms of accommodation, in terms of pay, in terms of allowances and remuneration, in terms of mobility, the commuting distances, etc., and compensates them for that, and looks after the state. The Armed Forces Covenant in the UK pledges the Ministry for Defence, their version of the Department of Defence, recognises the unique nature of UK military service and pledges to look after them, to treat their families and the servicemen and women fairly. At the moment, could we see that from our own department? And finally, we've spoken about a root and branch review of Defence Forces remuneration and service conditions, or conditions of service. The last one was in 1990. If I could draw an analogy to 1990, I was 10 years of age. However, I am told that at the time, the wives and partners were on the streets because the Defence Forces could not stick up for themselves. Does that sound familiar? So please, let's have another look at how we constitute our Defence Forces. Let's have another look at the relationship between military management, the Department of Defence, the representative associations, and the loyal men and women of Óglaigh na hÉireann. there would be the asks. I know they might sound like a lot, but I think they're within the gift of the government to provide, if they're really serious about treating the Defence Forces fairly.
Thanks, Conor. Deputy Ingus of Snoddig and then Senator Gerard Crockwell.
Earlier this week, I think Carl Berry, who I'm told is in the audience here, I think did a tremendous brave thing kind of for somebody who's left the Defence Forces, but he spoke up for the Defence Forces. And in what he said, you wouldn't expect it usually from a former member. And kind of I've met quite a number of members in recent years at the RACO conferences that I've attended, or in my work as a defence spokesperson for the party. And each and every one has expressed a frustration that I think came out in the words that were issued by Cahill during the week, where he talked about the department treating members with contempt, the Defence Force being dismantled and demoralised, but also came across in your own comments here today. And it's a frustration I can understand. You said that the department's approach to representation, divisive, dismissive and sometimes subversive, has led to an adversarial and dysfunctional industrial relations climate. That's a very serious charge, and you backed it up, which is the key part. You backed it up in chapter and verse, just even in your last comment there about 1990 was the last review of paying conditions in the Defence Forces. But one of the questions you put to us earlier was who's batting for you? And I know from attending this meeting that each and every one of us have the interests of the Defence Forces and trying to help are batting for you. And hopefully we will be able to, and I think just this appearance today, and hopefully it will get the coverage that it deserves, will add to the sense of crisis, because some of the figures you outlined, and as I said, I've been talking to people, kind of are very, very stark. You said 87% of the Defence Force earn well below the public sector wage. In our briefing from the Department of Defence today, we got a different take on that. And kind of I think your comment was just something similar. Somebody has to be the low pay, I think, was the dismissive attitude in some ways. But they said in a briefing, the starting pay, and they go into the details, and this compares favourably to other jobs with similar entry-level criteria in the public service. And I think that fails to understand what you were kind of saying at the end there, is the uniqueness of the Defence Forces. And you listed it, and I think that it's quite clear and stark. You can't have overtime. You are on 24-hour call, and you listed the whole lot. It is not a normal job. It is not similar to any other job in the public service, albeit maybe Garda Síochána, but who get overtime. And that's key. And also, in this day and age, the retirement ages in a world which is living longer, which people are fitter in the main, and kind of, I wish I was as fit as half of the officers who are retiring out of the Defence Forces. I might do well, but kind of to be retiring at the age of 47 or kind of 52 in this day and age, somebody needs to get real. When there's a crisis, you need action, and you mentioned the white paper, and my big criticism of the white paper was that there was no timelines. So whatever about having 88 particular actions, unless you have timelines, it's very difficult to manage, and so that feeds in. The real questions that I have are, you mentioned just in some sections of the Defence Forces just how low the officers, the number of officers are, and kind of again, thanks to the Department of Defence, they've told us now that there's 45 officers less in the Air Corps. supposed to be 166 establishment. There's only 141, and that's very stark. And we know the results of that, but I know from dealing with a number of personnel is the stress levels, the double jobbing, the treble jobbing of those. And if you look in the other part of our briefing, it shows that the sick level in the Defence Force is going up. Obviously it's going up. If somebody is working 2 and 3 jobs, something has to give. But one I've been concerned about, and I've raised it a few times, is, and you mentioned that the ordnance section is at 16% of the officer level in one particular area. That's scary. This is a part of the Defence Forces which needs virtually 100%, given how dangerous the role is. You mentioned the Navy, the same. If you have shifts tied up, because you can't get officers, or if they take off, leave the shore, anchor up, and then send some people that made up the number so that it can leave the port, that suggests a crisis, and I don't believe it is taken as seriously by the department. So what can we do, what can the public do to impress upon the department and the Minister, and the Taoiseach is the Minister, albeit there's a junior Minister, that this is at breaking point. And if it continues at the rate it's going, that you will end up not being able to deliver on a lot of the work and duties that the Defence Forces have, some as an aid to the civil power, some in terms of crisis management when there's humanitarian disaster or floods, or as we've seen recently in Donegal and places where there's fires. And we've seen it before, that the Defence Forces don't have the personnel to help out, albeit that they want to. And where is the breaking point where you end up nearly at a point of no return? There's a huge amount, but I want to compliment you just for how well you presented it and how stark, in just clear sense. Because sometimes, when this is presented, I differ with you in terms of the approach on trade union rights, but anything is better than where it's at the moment, where the representative associations can sit down and be heard and acted upon. So if that's what you require, well then, albeit I would be more inclined towards the full trade union rights as has happened in other countries. The final question is one I asked when you had the conference, which addressed the Working Time Directive, and you showed how it worked in other countries. Given the crisis at the moment, could the Working Time Directive be implemented in the Defence Forces, or would we have to wait for full establishment numbers, given that there is the crisis and the shortfalls that you've addressed, you've highlighted?
Thanks, Deputy Stundy. Senator Crockwell.
Thank you, Chair. Commandant Keogh, Commandant King, Lieutenant Colonel Priestley, I address you by your rank because together you represent over 60 years' experience in the Defence Forces as leaders in the Defence Forces. So you come here with no mean credentials. And I think it's a unique step that you've taken to come here, and I'm delighted you are here. I've got a couple of quick-fire questions that I want to put to you, and I'm going to lead into those straight away. I had some complaint some time ago when the Department of Defence sought the appointment of an additional Assistant Secretary-General. That appointment was specifically, we were told, a people's appointment. Now, I want to know who sets HR policy. Is it the Department? Is it the Minister? Is it the Secretary-General of the Department? Or is it the Defence Forces themselves? Is it correct to say at this stage that no operational unit has been visited by the newly appointed Assistant Secretary-General for People? Is it correct that the UK MOD report annually on the serviceable numbers they have, excluding those in training, and that they report to Parliament on that? Is it true that the Ordnance Corps is still recovering from the removal of fixed period promotion? I would like to know, has RACO submitted a complaint to the Oversight Committee on the pay, public service pay, and if you have you had a response? Why do you think nurses and teachers and guards and the like can make a submission to the Oversight Committee and seem to get immediate response and huge public response, if you want? On the other side, where you adverted to the heli side of the Air Corps, I recently learned, and I'm not asking you to confirm or deny this, other than to give me factual information with respect to the availability of fixed-wing or helicopter appliances. I'm told that there are only 2 helicopters available, one in the EAS service in Athlone and the second one on standby, and that because of the lack of technical support, a number of our aircraft are grounded. You will understand, Commandant King, that your Air Corps pilots require to maintain flying hours. And are their flying hours being impeded as a result of lack of aircraft? That's really my question. I don't want you to get into the operational side, but are pilots sitting on the ground, no aircraft to fly because of lack of technical people? Now, one of the areas that has been of deep concern to me, and you adverted to it here today, 1 captain out of 8 in Finner Camp. I'm aware of the fact that not so terribly long ago there was 1 captain and a number of lieutenants running a battalion. I'm also aware of the fact that we had a 2nd lieutenant in charge of, I think it was 3 platoons. I'm also aware of the fact that we had a 2nd lieutenant acting as adjutant. Now, you spoke about the experience that's required in those roles. I am deeply concerned that some 2nd lieutenant is going to find himself in serious trouble as a result of an accident, through no fault of his own or her own, purely because of lack of experience. I would like you to address the legal side of where we are with respect to junior leaders undertaking roles that were designed for senior leaders. The Defence Forces has a strong record of, if you want, standing up to the plate when called upon to do so. But are we asking people to take on roles that are way above their pay grade? And in taking on those roles, I'm mindful, for example, of the annual appraisal of soldiers. You get a 2nd lieutenant parachuted into a unit for a couple of weeks. He or she is asked to complete appraisals of soldiers he or she never knew. Those appraisals may impact the career of those soldiers over time. It is only a matter of time before the Defence Forces finds itself before a High Court judge explaining why some person was denied promotion or denied service overseas because of an appraisal by somebody who really didn't know him or her. And the final one, when I look at the Department of Defence and when they talk about salaries and things like that, they always put in the words excluding overseas service. Is overseas service now to be factored into the income of soldiers, sailors and air crew? Is that what we're talking about, that we now depend on United Nations service or service elsewhere in order to bolster our salaries for our service personnel in order that they can survive? And the final point, as you know, I'm a veteran of 2 armies. One of those armies will look after me to the day I die. To the day I die, I get a little badge to put on my collar, and I can go to the UK and I can walk into any museum, I can walk into any public service area, and I will be treated with the utmost of respect. And to the day I die, I can turn to the SAFA organisation if I find myself in trouble from a welfare perspective. We do not provide the level of respect and the level of gratitude for service in this country. I'm not asking you to comment to any great degree on that, but I would be interested in your view. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Crockwell. Commandant King.
Thank you very much, Senator Crockwell, and thank you very much, Deputy O'Snoddig. I'll start with Deputy O'Snoddig. The approach to representation, I think I've covered it in fairly great detail, and I think and you did, in fairness, you elaborated on that and you echoed what I spoke about. One thing which will highlight the attitude and the dealings that we have sometimes with our counterparts in the Department of Defence, you spoke about how retirement ages for people are living longer. And this boils down to, as well to our problem with the single pension scheme and the fact that we were forced to retire early and not being provided for. The Department of Public Expenditure and Reform commenced a process in August 2016 looking at retirement ages. And they asked all uniformed services, as well as all other public sector bodies, for their input on this, including the Department of Defence. Not the military management, the Department of Defence. And the reason for this, as the then Minister spoke about in 2017, was the fact that the state pension age was going up from 65 to 66. And woe betide anybody who had to retire at 65 and had to wait a full year for their old age pension. Yet, when they spoke about retirement ages for military personnel, the Department of Defence declined to be included in the review and stated, and it's in writing, I have the report here, that they will conduct their own review. That was in early 2017. 2 years later, despite many, many requests for such a review on mandatory retirement ages, that has not commenced. So, I think that says a lot about the concern that is expressed by the Department of Defence for military personnel. In relation to how can we show that this is a breaking point, well, the gentleman to my right, Commandant Seán Crowe, who was the RACO president 2 years ago at our conference, to great dismay of military management, but particularly the Department of Defence, said that we are in a state of crisis. 2 years ago, Deputy. When we had our first submission to the Public Service Pay Commission in early 2018, the turnover rate was about 7.5%. When we finally got an oral representation to the Public Service Pay Commission in March of this year, it was at 8.1%. It is now at 9%. In 6 months' time, I do not know what it will be. But what I can say is that there are soldiers, sailors and aircrew in Oireachtas na hÉireann who are living on the breadline. That is not an exaggeration. And they are watching the Public Service Pay Commission. They, I think, have decided almost in their heads that they are going, but they are trying to look for a reason to stay. That is the loyalty that they display towards Oireachtas na hÉireann. They don't want to leave, but they might have to. So you ask, I think you asked, where is the breaking point? Deputy, we've reached the breaking point. We're through the breaking point. We need to step back from the brink at this stage. You asked about the Working Time Directive, I think, and you asked about the health and safety provisions of the Working Time Directive. I've spoken a small bit about that, but I feel it's an extremely important point. And I might just get Derek to just elaborate on the Working Time Directive for a few minutes in terms of the health and safety provisions that it provides and the retention tool that it can be. But also the difficulties you did outline in, yes, the manning level shortages are so great that how are we actually going to bring it in? But that shouldn't be the point.
The important point about the Working Time Directive that it's a health and safety legislation. It is exempted, or the Defence Forces are currently exempted under the Organisation Working Time Act in 1997, I think it is, where there's a simple section, Section 3, that says on Garda Síochána the Defence Forces are exempt the following provisions. So there's a blanket exemption that's there. I think we're aware of various legal cases through Europe and at home as well, where it is now recognised widely that something has to be done in relation to the Organisation Working Time Act, and that the provisions within the directive then have to come back into Irish law. So what would we say about what has to come in? This is about providing rest periods for personnel. Personnel who currently have a 24/7 liability, as we've outlined. So it's about being able to say, in a working week, how many hours will you work? So define the working day in the Defence Forces, the working week, the working month. And you can invert that and say, well, the directive says, or the Act says you need X number of hours. You need 11 hours off in a day, you know. And that doesn't sit well necessarily with military operations, as we know. So you're brought into the realm of exemptions and derogations, and what does that mean? I think since 2014 or so, we've been calling for some kind of examination of this, and it has been very slow coming forward. It's a huge body of work. I'm well aware that the Garda representatives took 5 years to come up with an agreement. And it's only very recently that we've had kind of serious discussions with the Department of Defence and military management as to how we might implement it within the Defence Forces. But it is something that is crying out to help all the issues we talk about in terms of health and safety, retention, that needs to be brought in. And we can't delay any longer. We look to the various climate surveys that were conducted, and we talk about stress. 16% of Defence Force members said they were stressed. That cannot be a healthy situation. We have ordnance officers who literally do 7 24-hour duties in a row and are expected to go back to work the following. Like they commence on a Friday at 11:30, finish on the following Friday at 11:30, and once upon a time, not so long ago, were expected to come back to work on the Monday. With great resistance, we managed to bring that back to Wednesday. You know, what kind of work-life balance does anybody have in that regard? You know, highly skilled, highly trained, took a long time to fund and develop those skills, recognised internationally as world leaders in their trade, and then we wonder why people are running out the door. I could list a long list of other jobs I know experienced ordnance officers went out to, but you know, what's the point really? They've left is the point. The removal of fixed period promotion was certainly a catalyst for these people to leave. I remember not so long ago talking to a guy who had left, and he went out to a large organisation. Similarly, they did 24-hour shifts, but he couldn't understand the amount of time he got off after he did a 24-hour duty. All of a sudden, he was at a loss what to be doing. And you can't blame them, you know. So the Working Time Directive is a very, very significant body of work. We've been delaying it for far too long. We have been trying to progress it, and it needs to come in now. It was one of the questions you referred to earlier on about how can we help. This is legislation we're talking about. I think you need to be very mindful of that. And probably enough said there.
Thanks, Derek. If I can move on to Senator Brockwell. The first question that you asked was about the appointment of Assistant Secretary for People in the Department of Defence. I don't really want to personalise it in terms of any particular individual. If you say that that person has not visited the barracks, then I'll take your word for it. What I can say is we certainly have had not that much contact with the Assistant Secretary for People, and I have had one meeting with him in 6 months since I took over as General Secretary. And how many meetings did you have?
Same one.
In 5 years. In 5 years. So that's all I want to say about that. The UK MOD report annually on trained manning levels and strengths. There's nothing wrong with that. That is a democracy. You should be reporting. But the key point, and I think you have identified it, is they report on trained strength. They don't include 500 recruits or cadets in their strength figures. So I think the Irish public are starting to realise now that when the Defence Forces is described as having an establishment of 9,500 and a strength of 8,750, I'm surmising, that you must take away 500 or 600 recruits or cadets from that. And also there are the overseas, leave of absence, secondment, sick leave, etc. So we need to understand what strength and station is, and I think we've painted a clear enough picture. I'm not personally aware of the specific amount of helicopters available to the Air Corps. If there are only 2 available to the Air Corps, then that is a dire situation. I'm not qualified to comment. I don't have the figures to hand. What I can say is Air Corps cadetships are now touching 5 years due to lack of aircraft. Okay. In terms of, you did speak about governance again, and I have covered governance and mentoring, but I suppose I'd like to get paint another picture of governance, and I might get Shane to do that as the President, just in terms of the supervision, mentoring, work-life balance, etc., that's affecting the line units in the Defence Forces.
Well, I suppose we've been talking about how loyal the officers of the Defence Forces are, and people mentioned Cathal Berry earlier on, and he had to leave because he couldn't do anything internally, and that's a very strange dichotomy. So what is happening? What is happening on the ground is there are now so many gaps at officer level for the reasons that Conor has alluded to. So The establishment for overseas isn't catered for within the unit strength. The number of people in training isn't catered for in the unit strength. So there are gaps day to day in every unit in the Defence Forces. And what's the net effect of that? Well, effectively, those that remain there are carrying the extra burden. And they are very well trained, and they do take that task on extremely well. The young officers out there are doing a fantastic job, but they can only do so much. One job you can do well, 2 jobs, you're still doing okay. When you get your 3rd and 4th job, it's hard to keep up. And that leaves huge issues in terms of governance. That leads significant issues in terms of the risk. And the difficulty is the risk lays on the shoulder of those young officers, NCOs. So it's that frustration which has come home to roost in terms of the numbers leaving the Defence Forces. And so I hope that can paint some sort of picture in terms of governance and risk at the unit level, which is really what it's about, because they are the true coalface of our organisation.
Thanks, Shane. Just to double up on the governance and risk, but also the importance of hanging on to your suitably qualified and experienced personnel. The Air Corps sought to bring in an expert to talk to them about the difficulties that they were undergoing in January 2017. And they brought in a gentleman, Queen's Counsel Sir Charles Haddon-Cave. He was author of The Loss of the RAF Nimrod, which was subtitled A Failure of Leadership, Culture and Priorities. And he appealed to defence management, Air Corps management, defence management, to treasure and hold on to suitably qualified and experienced personnel. It's a recognised term, I think, in business, SQEPS, in order to retain critical capabilities, including specialised management functions associated with military aviation. And according to our Air Corps colleagues, unfortunately, experience takes years to build but can be lost instantly. And when experienced personnel are leaving faster than they can be replaced, the burden of safe operations falls on fewer shoulders. And this risks overtasking, it risks burnout and overstretch. And society, look, it expects military personnel to just get on with the job, meet any demands, achieve the mission. And we try to do it, we really do. We have an ethos of meeting the demands, and we have an ethos of not saying no, okay? But without sufficient qualified and experienced personnel, this leads, in the words of Sir Charles Haddon-Cave, to a potentially dangerous ethos of can do, make do, muddle through. So I'm just going to leave it at that in terms of the governance issues, but you can see that we've been talking about this for a while. 2017, the Air Corps brought this gentleman in. Limerick, University of Limerick Focus Group report in 2017 spoke about that there are serious concerns from an organisational level presented here. The Defence Forces is reaching a point of being hollowed out in terms of experienced human capital, that notwithstanding the increased recruitment of cadets, it would take 10+ years to replace that expertise that has been lost. In 2017, we are way worse now. Officers have expressed that management's focus on recruitment rather than retention is their primary source of stress. This has led to having higher numbers of inexperienced members, while those with sufficient experience and capability are leaving. The workload is increasing, and there are fewer members to do the work. So this has led to an inability to meet demand to the standard required. Members are feeling overworked, and officers fear for the safety of their members and the capability of performing to the best possible standard. 2017, ladies and gentlemen. Since the publication of this report, no new policy initiatives have been introduced by management to address the underlying issues identified by the University of Limerick researchers. Going back to the Gleeson Commission, I just want to say that in 1990, and I do draw an analogy back to 1990, they stated at paragraph 3710 that one factor which must be taken into account is a need to arrive at rates of pay which are sufficient to enable the Defence Forces to recruit and retain personnel of the proper quality. It sounds like common sense. And to ignore identifiable problems of recruitment will be to run the risk that the Defence Forces will be unable to secure the services of sufficient numbers of suitable personnel. To ignore clear evidence of difficulties would lead to outflow of skilled personnel. In either event, the capacity of the Defence Forces to carry out the tasks assigned to them could be undermined, and the problems would take many years to remedy. This finding is particularly relevant as the retention of commissioned officers continues to be a major challenge for the Defence Forces. 1990, 30 years ago almost, and here we are again. You asked about HR policy. I'm going to ask Derek to tackle that one.
Thank you, Senator, again for your quick-fire questions. And I suppose the notion of an overriding HR policy, the only thing I can say about it is in 2014, when I came into this job first, I sought out a HR policy to read into and brief myself on, to be sadly told that none existed. You then link to the white paper, and you know, the identified 27 projects that we feel have an IOR or a HR you know, aspect too. And when we go and seek information about that, how it's progressing, how it's getting on, the information available to us to comment on or to get involved in or to influence is very, very limited. The phrase earlier was used earlier, you know, transition to normal business. What does that mean? What's the product? You know, what do we look to for guidance? Where's the retention policy? We simply really don't know. Can't really comment any further. That's a quick-fire answer to that, really, you know.
Thanks, Derek. Just finally, I spoke about suitably qualified and experienced personnel. The Air Corps can't fly without air traffic control. Okay, we all know that and we recognise that. Dublin Airport does not operate without its air traffic controllers. They are highly skilled, highly qualified and expensively qualified personnel. Currently, air traffic control is at 66% for officers, 50% for non-commissioned officers. They carry out the same function. They are all air traffic controllers. In December 2016, the 24-hour air traffic control service in Baldonnel was reduced to 8 o'clock in the morning till 1800 or 6 o'clock in the evening service. It is now, since January of 2018, back up to 7 o'clock in the morning till 2300, but it is no longer a 24-hour service. At night, a fireman sits in the tower. There are no air traffic controllers at night. GAZU and EIS rely on Dublin Airport to fly in and out. And air traffic controllers are only on call at the weekends. There is no dedicated air traffic control service at the weekends because of lack of resources, not because of lack of will. Okay? And yes, personnel do depend on UN service to supplement their incomes. That's a fact. Any other questions, Senator, that I've missed?
There was one there about the legal responsibility of leaders in the field, where you have young officers taking on several roles, for example.
Happily, the President of RACO is a legal officer, so I might defer to your knowledge, Shane.
Thank you. Senator, yeah, I think I've kind of touched on it. The reality is we are the leaders of the organisation. We have a responsibility to look after our troops. And that's where the frustration comes from. The people want to do their job properly. People want to be able to sit down and do an annual report, knowing the individual very, very well. Unfortunately, that's not the case in some units because the turnover rate is such that young officers come into a unit, they're gone overseas, they're gone to a different unit, or gone to a training institution before they've had the opportunity to build up that appropriate relationship between their subordinates. I don't want to get too far into the operational sphere, but the reality is that impinges on the well-being of young officers. We're putting all that responsibility on their shoulders without giving them appropriate backup. That's the point I would make on that point. Just in terms of the working time directive, that's, you know, it's basically it's law. Just because we have an exemption under the 1997 Act doesn't give us a pass. And that's been established in the European courts. So we are in flagrant disregard of the working time directive. There is a requirement for us to implement it, and not because soldiers need more time off. It's from a health and safety perspective. You have to give them appropriate time off, the time off that they deserve, because they are doing hours which are not just 9 to 5 in many cases. You have a lot of 24-hour duties. People could be on exercise for up to a week, or even be overseas for numerous months, from 6 months to a year, whatever the case may be. So this is not the standard employ, and we have to come up with suitable solutions to maintain the health and safety benefits for all of our soldiers, sailors and aircrew.
Thanks. Senator Terry Leighton.
Thank you very much, Chairman. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I'm Vice Chairman of the European Affairs Committee, but I'm not a member of this committee. And I just say to commiserate with you, Deputy, on the fact that you weren't elected to Europe on this occasion. But Europe's lost is Ireland's gain, quite frankly, and you're going to settle back. And in fact, I commend you by being here today for the session after such a gruelling election campaign. I'd like to welcome a delegation from RACO, welcome to Commandant Conor King, RACO General Secretary, replaced Lieutenant Colonel Ernan Naughton, and Lieutenant Derek Priestley, Deputy General Secretary RACO, and Association President Commandant Seán Crowe, and indeed the Public Gallery Cathal Berry, who has made a great contribution, highlighted issues. And the fact that you're here today with television coverage nationally and internationally here, it's a wonderful opportunity for you to highlight what exactly is happening in our defence forces. And I hope and I expect that the Minister of State is watching it at the moment very carefully. And I also know that the Department are looking in very carefully and analysing what you're saying. So, gentlemen and ladies, please listen to what the contribution is today and take action. Now, I'm also here because the Irish Conference of Professional and Service Associations, which RACO and PD4 and the Gardaí members are a nominating body for the Seanad on the Labour panel, and I've been there for 17 years in the Seanad as nomination by the organisation. And saying over those years, I've never come across such discontent and concerns in the Army from RACO and PD4 over the last number of years. It's particularly forceful. And in fact, I see former Minister Seán Barrett here, who was elected Minister for Defence, but you haven't a full Cabinet Minister, Minister for Defence. The Taoiseach has other duties which are national. He can't give the time to the Defence Forces. The Minister of State has no vote in the Cabinet, or sits in the Cabinet room, he cannot get involved. And that's why, when I hope Seán Barrett might make this point, but it was always regarded that Defence Forces had a senior Cabinet Minister. And indeed, I hope that Jack Chambers takes on that job in the not too distant future, and that the incoming government will have a full-time dedicated minister. It is very important. Now, just to ask a question, look, I want to commend you on your contribution. I'm not going to go back over what's been said here and the number of personnel. That's been said. You put the case forward. That's your task, and you put it forward very well with your contribution. The restoration of the 4th Western Brigade, based at Custom Barracks at Lone, is that a realistic proposition, the fact that you're not up to full strength at the moment? A Dáil debate on the 4th of April 2017, Defence Force motion then by Lisa Chambers, then spokesman, now Jack Chambers is spokesperson. Just let's be clear about this. What are the chances that that will happen? And I just want to commend other spokespeople here speaking on this. And just finally want to say, there's $3 billion being dedicated to broadband. Broadband is needed, no doubt about that, and we all need it. But broadband won't fly the planes, or protect our coasts, or protect our fisheries. That will not. But there's no difficulty whatsoever in this government, with a dodgy contract, awarding $3 billion of our money and neglecting the people who are defending it. If I had a choice between having broadband in my house or the Army being looking after our interests, I know where I'd vote for. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Leighton. Commandant King.
Thanks. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Chairman.
Just goes broadband in this context.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Point of view in comparison to priorities of this government, and the Army is not the priority. That's the point.
You made the point. You made the point very well, Senator Leighton. But Commandant King.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much, Senator Leighton. Yes, I presume that the Defence Forces would benefit from a senior Cabinet Minister. It couldn't but that's a matter for government. Is the restoration of the 4th Western Brigade a realistic proposition? If it is done properly, of course. Of course it is, but we need to be up to strength before that happens. We require a large strength in the Defence Forces to carry out our assigned tasks, and that will be part of the reason why a root and branch review of what the government wants us to do as a Defence Forces for the state should be conducted. And when it decides what it wants us to do, please resource us properly and we'll do it for you. So is the restoration of the 4th Western Brigade a realistic proposition? What I can say is that it is extremely difficult to recruit from the west of Ireland now. It is extremely difficult to attract and retain people who are living west of the Shannon now, because the uncertainty, the large commuting distances, the frequency of posting, which is 8 in 5 years for senior officers, and the distances from home and the effects on work-life balance for officers of the former Western Brigade who haven't left at this stage is certainly stark. Okay? I do know that in 2012 we had a large outflow of personnel as well, and well over 50% of the outflow in 2012 were personnel from the former 4th Western Brigade, because they didn't see a future in commuting to the far reaches of the country. But again, we have to do it properly. The reorganisation in 2012, I'm not sure was it done properly. I'm not really qualified to comment any further on that. Have I answered your question, Senator?
Thanks, Commissioner King. Just one thing. Some months ago, we had the Chief of Staff here with us, and he was as forthcoming as was possible. Obviously, he didn't enter into the political realm. We can understand that fully. But he was very forthcoming with us. As you are aware, the Commissioner of An Garda Síochána is the accounting officer, whereas, as you know, the Chief of Staff is not the accounting officer for the Defence Forces. Has it ever been discussed, or maybe it's unfair of me to ask that question, but has it been discussed among your own personnel what benefits could accrue from the Chief of Staff being the accounting officer? You know, the accounting officer appears before committees.
I do.
And I think when we had the Chief of Staff with us, I presume it was the first time ever there was a Chief of Staff before an Oireachtas committee. And when we requested the Chief of Staff to attend, he readily agreed to our invitation. And I want to put on the record our appreciation of his engagement with us on the committee and at that meeting as well, and all of my colleagues would have been here and engaged very constructively with the Chief of Staff. He indicated to us that he would like to have further engagement, you know, if we sought so in the future. Yeah. But has it been discussed within the Defence Forces what benefits might accrue from the Chief of Staff being the accounting officer? If you're uncomfortable dealing with it, I don't have a problem.
I'm not uncomfortable with that question. There is no doubt about it that the military authorities are uniquely placed to provide military advice to government. Uniquely placed. And if it was a question that a military-specific operational budget was to be allocated to the Chief of Staff, then I would see that that person would be the competent authority to decide how that money would be spent. But it would have to be done properly. It would have to be resourced. There would have to be a proper staff to supplement the accounting officer. And I'm not really sure, to be honest, if comparable military organisations have their Chief of Defence as the accounting officer. I don't know. The Commissioner of An Garda Síochána is the accounting officer, and I'm sure that that gives that person more freedom in how to allocate his or her resources. But that's, again, a matter for government.
Yeah.
And I think it was very heartening to see the Chief of Staff here in front of the Oireachtas Committee. I'm not sure whether you asked him whether he wanted to be the accounting officer or not at the time, and I don't know what his response was. What I would say is we will be...
I was being fair. Most people would take on more responsibilities if they could.
Yeah.
So I didn't ask.
Sorry, Chair. Just two brief points. One on the Chief of Staff. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that at the PD4 conference, he did something that I believe no Chief of Staff has done. He stepped outside and placed his cards very firmly on the table, and short of doing what Commandant Berry has done and placing his hat on the Taoiseach's table and saying, I'm out of here if you don't, I don't know what more he can do. But I just want to go back on ICTU for a moment. I mean, surely you'd be better off in ICTU than out there on your own, sitting in the corridor. I sat at pay talks and watched you in the corridor.
Sorry, Senator Crockwell, you'll take that question later. You just finished with the one I was dealing with.
Yeah, sorry, Chairman. The last point I wanted to make, and I think
no, I think we specifically did not ask the Chief of Staff, because I don't think we want to put him in a position of.
Well, I think if it's not for the Chief of Staff to answer, it's certainly not for me to answer.
Yeah. But I was just wondering, has it been a subject of conversation?
Certainly, there's a general interest in whether or not the Chief of Staff should be the accounting officer for the Defence Forces.
Did you?
I think I asked.
Yes.
I think he said it's a matter for department and government to decide what responsibilities he has.
I will say though, again, and I did say this already, I think it's fairly obvious that the military authorities are the competent authorities to decide how operational budgets are spent. I think that's common sense.
Yeah. And you might, sometimes I'm sure you have dialogue with other defence forces. It might be, you might let us know if you come across it where there's a different structure in regard to the accounting officer position.
And may I also say that we would also welcome future engagement with the committee if that was available to us, and we would hope dearly that the next engagement with the committee will be on much more positive terms, because we are all about positivity and can-do attitude. We don't want to be painting a negative picture of the Defence Forces.
But we speak for ourselves. We've been positive on this engagement.
Absolutely.
And we want to be, all of my colleagues here and others who are here earlier, all want to be positive. Yes. And probably this committee, under my stewardship, has been more active on defence issues than other committees in the past. I think that's the way we need it to be, and that would be the view of all members, of all parties and none on this committee. Senator Crockwell's brief question, and then we'll go back to Deputy Chambers.
I firmly acknowledge that point, that this committee has been hugely interested in the welfare of the Defence Forces. What I meant was,
appreciate.
If we come before this committee again, we hope not to be telling such a sad story.
I appreciate that. I was just thinking somebody listening in might think we were
not at all. Not at all.
Just Senator Crockwell's question about ICTU.
We have spoken about our industrial relations status. We have spoken about the fact that strike action and withdrawal of labour is not compatible with military service. I think the European Court of Justice has ruled on that, and it's not compatible with military service to take to the streets or withdraw labour, and it's not something that sits comfortably with RACO. Do you want to come in on that, Derek?
Yeah, look, again, I think we can only reflect the firmly held views of the membership, and it's not that long ago since we did a national tour in all the barracks meeting our membership, and this issue came up because it's quite topical at the moment, and very few of our members would welcome the opportunity to go into ICTU, and there's very good reasons around that, and I don't particularly want to go into lots of them, but at the end of the day, we recognise our role in society, we recognise the job we do, and we just feel it would provide a lot of difficulties for us if we were to be in ICTU. Hence why we prefer the alternative of the notion of some kind of pay review body unique to of that. We can't on one hand say we do 24/7 liability and all the restrictions in military service that you well know, Senator, and we well know, and then feel we should be treated like every other normal employee. We don't see ourselves as normal employees. So all we can do is reflect the honest held view of our membership who do not see themselves going into ICTU any day soon.
Could I come in on that point as well? Just very, very briefly. We are aware of overtures being made by the Department of Defence on behalf of another representative association to join the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. We're not aware what the military management views are on that, but we wouldn't expect them to be too complimentary. But again, from RACO's perspective, we are not seeking to join the Irish Congress of Trade Unions because we believe it is not compatible with military service. But again, at the same time, if the state doesn't look after us and doesn't look after the welfare of its personnel, its military personnel, there aren't that many alternatives. So I can understand why other representative associations might be looking for other avenues. And Senator, and let me just finish by saying as well, you mentioned as well the way that the fond recollections you have of serving with two armed forces. May I compliment you on your service with both? I think that you've been a wonderful advocate for the Defence Forces, a tirelessly wonderful advocate for the Defence Forces, and it is so appreciated by the soldiers, sailors and aircrew of Oireachtas. I'm delighted to see that the UK Armed Forces are still looking after you. You will always be welcome in any barracks in this state, that's for sure.
Thanks, Commandant. Deputy Jack Chambers and other colleagues with final supplementary brief questions from all, please.
Thanks, Chair, and I agree with the suggestion that I think it'd be good to have regular engagement, formal engagement at the committee, so that I suppose there's an accountability structure for the department on many of the issues you've outlined, so that there can be a proper public airing. Because sometimes when we raise the issues on the floor of the Dáil, we just have a departmental memo read out from the Minister. So perhaps to provide some truth and context, it's important we have you here on a more regular basis rather than hearing the nonsense from him. Just in terms of the issue of morale, I mean, how do your members feel when you know, other frontline public servants like the Gardaí got a 55 million bounce, nurses got a 35 million pay supplement, and RACO and PD4 aren't even allowed to attend oversight committees? How do your members feel to be treated as the worst paid public servants, to be treated out, to be put outside the room and to be denigrated in that way when others are getting their pay issues addressed? Can you provide some kind of, I suppose, just the morale issues around that and the choreography of it, where we have some people getting some things because they can threaten with their right to strike, and the fact that Defence Force personnel can't do that, that there's that's being used and abused around pay. Just in terms of the Air Corps, do you think a single agency should be established? Obviously, some of the previous functions provided by the Air Corps have been removed and undermined and split up, so should that be established? And I suppose my final question relates to the how do you feel that the military advice and the recommendations that were included in the Pay Commission were all stripped out and removed by the Department of Defence? And you know, how do your members feel about that, the fact that all of the recommendations around pay were butchered by the civil service, and what's your view on that matter? And also the fact as well that the fact that the parent joint submission was then further butchered by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and that was confirmed by the Minister for Public Expenditure, Paschal Donoghue, and that's why the alarming leaks aren't so surprising when you have a no case presented by the civil servants. So they're just my final questions.
Thanks, Deputy Chambers. And I've just a final question myself. You mentioned the briefing from the department indicates to us that the strength of the Permanent Defence Force at the end of March was 8,847 whole-time equivalents. In your introductory remarks, you remarked to us that in reality the strength is nearly 1,000 lower than that, taking into consideration the duties and training of others. You might just specifically go back on those figures that you alluded to in your earlier contribution, please.
Okay. Well, I take that supplementary first and then yours, Deputy.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. How do we feel being excluded and our representative status not being taken advantage of? I think somebody described it during the week as gut-wrenching, a sense of betrayal. It is visceral. It is. Okay. I fully agree with that. The fact that we have sought to get before the Lansdowne Road Agreement to Oversight Committee and been blocked at every juncture or being ignored. We have a claim in since October, November 2018. It took 12 weeks for a response to that claim, and it was precipitated by a further communication from RACO through the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. Again, another few weeks, no answer. Finally, we got a response from the department. We weren't satisfied with that response. We asked to go before the Oversight Committee, to be told another 2 months later that the Oversight Committee wasn't sitting for these few months, despite the fact we knew that the INMO were in there on a daily basis, agitating for their members. So, without being flippant, how do you think it feels? In terms of how do we feel that other unions or other public service bodies can agitate successfully for better pay for their members? Well, sure, it's very difficult to take. It's very difficult to take. We do rely on the goodwill of the state and the goodwill of government to look after us. In return, we provide unremitting loyalty to the state. Some might call it blind loyalty. We just want to reward it. You spoke about the military advice from DOD and the military advice from military management in relation to the Public Service Pay Commission. I'm painfully aware that the Public Service Pay Commission has yet to respond. It would be difficult for me to cast aspersions on the independence of that body. However, what I can say is that in the future and going forward, we would like an independent, standing Defence Forces pay review body to look after the unique nature of military service and ensure that our loyalty is rewarded, so we don't have to rely on ad hoc public service pay commissions or public sector pay talks, where we have no stake in the game as such. Was there another question?
Just a single agency being established around the airport.
Do you want to take that one?
Again, it's a matter for government, really, what way resources are divided up on it. But it does seem to us, you know, when you talk to Air Corps colleagues right across the spectrum there, that they want to do those roles. They feel they're very competent to do those roles. I think they were very, very disappointed and upset when certain roles, particularly the search and rescue, was taken away. I mean, I think we're all familiar that 500 million was the figure put for the contract for the search and rescue. You know, I think the sense there was that they feel they could have done a lot with that money rather than giving it out to a private contractor. But as I say, that's a matter for government. But for the professionalisation and the professional officers that fly and do the, you know, everything from the aero technicians to even the firefighters that are out there, the air traffic controllers, they felt they were uniquely placed to provide that service, and I think they were very. It did have an impact that is lasting. I could only say that they would dearly love to do as much work. We saw recently, you know, with the forest fires, people travelling long distances on the weekend. They were meant to be off to come in and respond to that. The Air Corps, you know, from the GOC down to the most junior apprentice out there, I'm sure is dying to do those jobs. So of course it has an impact. I think they would love to be able to do all those jobs.
And you had a question, Deputy, about the strength figures. And you spoke about whole-time equivalents and what is reported to the Dáil. So if I can break it down into strength in station versus strength on paper. And the fact of the matter is that induction training, where in the unprecedented numbers that is currently ongoing, that is being counted by official sources when they talk about Defence Forces operational strength. So recruits and cadets are counted in that 8,800 odd figure that you have given to me. So take 500 or 600 off that. Take another 100 plus personnel who are currently on leave of absence or special leave without pay and allowances off that figure. And operationally, domestically, you can take another 700 people who are overseas. Now, if there are 700 people overseas, there are 700 people getting ready to go overseas as well who are not available to their units. But we won't count that 700 figure. So that's why, where the establishment is 9,500, the reported strength is 8,800, the actual strengthened station available is well closer to 7,500. Okay? Now,
so you're saying it's nearer 7,000 is the operational capacity of the Defence Force at this present time.
And not only that, and this is a very important point, the figures are artificially inflated by the amount of junior, inexperienced personnel that have been taken in at the lower level, for example, cadets and recruits. So in a unit, and I have very close experience of this as a former operational commander of a mechanised company in the DFTC, We had an establishment for 140 private soldiers. We had a strength of over 190. Where we fell down was we had an establishment for 34 corporals and a strength of 7. So we have all these private soldiers who need mentoring, who need training and supervision, and no qualified non-commissioned officers or officers to train them. So that's why the figures are artificially inflated, Deputy. Have I been clear enough in the explanation?
Just one question, Chair. There was a vacancy, or 365 non-commissioned officer vacancies, I believe, last year or the year before. Can't remember the exact number, but it was over 300. How does that arise?
I'm not quite sure of the details, Senator, but I think there was a lot of discussion around promotion systems for NCOs and what was agreed with our sister association, PD4.
Okay.
I'm not sure what I can put. I can't put my finger down to anything else other than I know there was an ongoing discussions around that, and I think some of that was held up there.
Okay, that's fine.
So I don't know.
Okay.
On behalf of the committee, can I thank you for your presentation here today. It paints a very bleak picture of the situation at all ranks within our permanent defence forces, but very low morale, and you raise questions in regard to the well-being of officers, of soldiers, of sailors, of aircrew, all aspects of our defence forces, and of course the loss of corporate knowledge and the loss of expertise and experience. That's a huge blow to our permanent defence forces, and the government will have to take action to deal with this unprecedented crisis, unprecedented retention crisis that you reference on a number of occasions. And we cannot have a completely demoralised defence forces for the good of our country. It's disappointing to learn, as well as my colleagues referred to, an obsession by the department with control, with micromanagement. We will be putting those questions to the department and to the Minister in our next engagement as well. We will follow that up. And I heard a former Army officer make comments in the broadcast media within the last few days that when a memo goes to government, there's very little input from the military side. It's a Department of Defence memo rather than a major contribution being made by the military. That was a comment that was made by a retired senior officer. If that's true, then that's disappointing as well. But for society, we need a properly and strongly and adequately resourced permanent defence forces. And oftentimes at this committee, we refer to the great service that our permanent defence forces give to us. I'm very conscious where I come from of the subversion that existed on our island over a period of 30 years, from the late 1960s to the late 1990s. And I recall very well the huge contribution of members of the Permanent Defence Force, members of An Garda Síochána, members of the Reserve Defence Forces as well, in dealing with those dangers that confronted our society. And of course, the great work that's ongoing, that has been done over the decades by our Army, it has also enhanced our international reputation as a country. We're very proud of the women and men who have served in overseas missions and peacekeeping missions in dangerous situations over the decades as well, and we compliment them on their huge contribution to Ireland's international reputation and our national reputation as well. One of the comments you made early on was that there's a dilution of security clearance measures in recruiting people. That would have to raise alarm bells. You're suggesting, if I'm reading your comments right, that adequate security precautions are not being taken now in relation to the recruitment of some individuals in the Permanent Defence Forces. I would sincerely hope that we're not going that road. And you also question, you raise the problems that arise from inadequate training timelines as well. They're all issues that have to be of concern to us as an Oireachtas, as a society. And all we can do is say that we'd be very glad to support directly to the Minister and to the Department the issues that you have raised here with us today. And as my colleague Deputy Chambers said, and Senator Layton as well, as a committee we would be glad to continue to have engagement with your association and also with your fellow representative associations as well. I think it's important that you have the opportunity here to to outline the issues of concern, and that we have that engagement as well, and it informs us better in raising parliamentary questions and in other Dáil debates as well. Can I just say that we will raise, with the agreement of the committee, I will write to the Minister outlining a few particular issues that you raised in regard to a defence pay review body. I presume with regard to pay you would also include pay and conditions, review of service pay and conditions, and also the need to have adequate retention measures and the need to deal with the pensions issue that you outlined as well. So we will raise those particular issues. We will have engagement again with the Minister, hopefully at an early date. He has been before us at this committee on a number of occasions over the past few months, but you can take it that we will write to the committee raising the issues that I have just outlined, and that we will have further direct engagement at committee level with the Minister as well. And if there are other issues that you wish to bring to our attention, you can communicate them to the clerk of the committee, and all of that correspondence is brought to all individual members, and it's a useful information process for us as well. So I just want to thank you again for your presentation and your engagement, and the engagement of my fellow committee members on this very important issue as well, and to put on the record again our appreciation of the work that our Permanent Defence Forces and the Reserve Defence Forces do on a daily basis on behalf of all of us, work that we never hear about, but it's protecting our society, protecting our country and protecting us. This meeting now stands adjourned until 9:30 on Thursday, 13th of June, and as we discussed earlier, we have a number of other informal meetings between now and the next formal committee meeting. Thank you very much.